Hello, 7th graders. Let's go ahead and finish up the Civil War notes. We've got one more section of notes that I'm going to put out coming up, which will be Reconstruction, and then that should take us through the end of the year. Where we left off, we had talked about sort of the midpoint of the war, what had been going on in terms of, we talked about the draft, right? The economic changes that were happening in terms of like the issuing of paper money, but also have to look at what these supplies are looking like. And on one hand, you've got in the north new farming technology, new machinery, things that are allowing farming to get a little bit more easier, is beginning to really help the Union generate more agricultural money. This is the same kind of stuff that some historians argue, if the Civil War didn't happen, these same machines might have eventually phased out slave labor on plantations. Obviously, we'll never know for sure, but it probably would have played a role, right? It would have certainly changed some things. The South begins to stop shipping cotton. They say they're not going to sell cotton to European countries unless they agree to come help them. This backfires real bad. A lot of these European countries just buy their cotton elsewhere. The South is not the only place in the world capable of growing cotton. They just go and buy it from Brazil or Central and Southern American countries. And by the time the South begins to open up cotton trade again, it's too late. They've lost some of their sales. So it's an example of them trying to, in a way, strong arm, people into supporting them. And they kind of shoot themselves in the foot. And that combined with the blockade means that the South is slowly being starved out of this war. And potentially, given enough time, that could end the war by itself. But we do start to see some changes. When we look in the North, there's, Lincoln's going through generals and commanders very rapidly. McClellan is replaced by a guy by the name of Burnside. Burnside is replaced by a guy named Joseph Hooker. They're going through, he's looking for a general who can win reliably and, win in convincing ways, right? He doesn't want a general who, wins occasionally. Lincoln's looking to end this. The longer this war draws on, the more damage it's doing to the whole of the United States. And he needs, some pretty drastic changes. And alongside that comes the Battle of Gettysburg. So Gettysburg is the final time that Robert E. Lee and the South invade the North. It is an absolutely massive battle in which almost 50,000 U.S. citizens die. That's casualties on both North and South. It is where Lincoln gives the famous Gettysburg Address. It is, according to some sources, there were parts of this battlefield that were, the ground was literally just red with the amount of blood from soldiers who had been shot or bayonet, stabbed or cut and, blown to bits by cannons. I mean, it's a super bloody battle. And it was one of those things that, even winning it, you didn't really win, right? You have this massive loss of life. So a huge important battle in the war. Another important one along the same lines, the Siege of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the big, powerful fort that controlled the Mississippi River, the final stronghold, the last bastion for the South to hold control of this river. And Ulysses S. Grant is able to win this battle here by, again, a blockade of sorts, starving out the South. And the Siege of Vicksburg lasts weeks. And the South puts up a really, lengthy siege. According to sources, they, once all the food was eaten in the town of Vicksburg, that they began killing their horses, and they ate their horses. And when they ate all the horses, they began killing pets, dogs and cats. And when they ran out of dogs and cats, they began hunting rats, mice, things living in the buildings, and eating them, till eventually they're forced to surrender. They're literally starved out. And you can see the picture here. You can see the ironclads, opening fire. And the siege was an incredibly, nerve-wracking sort of thing. But this victory was so convincing, the end of it, that this is the reason that Grant becomes a commander of the entire Union Army. That Lincoln promotes him. He says, finally, I got a guy who can get me some wins, right? And Grant's going to be changing, the perspective of this war, the strategies that he's going to employ. And that's because one thing that Grant is a supporter of is this idea of total war. He says that war is not just soldiers fighting one another on a battlefield. That war is a all-encompassing thing, that it affects the entirety of a country. And he says that if you want your enemies to surrender, you have to put pressure on them to surrender. You have to make the civilians want to surrender. And so the way you do that is you need to crush your enemy's will to fight. You need to destroy their resources. You need to not just attack the military camp, you need to burn the crops, right, so they can't eat. You need to tear down the buildings in these towns. You need to attack civilian areas as well as military areas. One thing that we're kind of very lucky to have today is when there are wars that the United States goes and fights, they're not really on American soil, right? When the U.S. sends troops over to the Middle East, which we still do, you're not necessarily worried day to day, right? You don't have Middle Eastern soldiers coming and attacking U.S. towns, right? It's just something you read about or you hear about in the news, and it's happening on the other side of the world, right? When things go wrong for the military and you're reading about it on the other side of the world, it doesn't have as much of an effect on you as if it was you read the news and it was, Soviet forces invade, the city of Chicago. That would be a lot more real, right? That's much closer. It's something that could be happening, right? That's why Ulysses S. Grant is supportive of that. He says, if you go in and you destroy these towns and you make it real for the Southerners, they will put pressure on their government to surrender. They will, in a way, help you surrender, help you win by making them surrender. It's a very weird stance to take during a civil war, though. Again, if you're fighting a different country, you can view those people as enemies, right? But you're fighting to keep the United States together. That means he's kind of okay with U.S. citizens being killed, right? And we'll come back to a guy he puts in charge of this total war thing in a second, who in southern schools they used to teach of him as a villain, right? But first, as he marches towards Richmond, again, like I said at the beginning of this unit, Grant is not the best military commander the United States has ever had. He has 2 times the troops that Robert E. Lee has, twice as many troops, yet despite Lee losing a lot of battles, he loses less troops per battle. He, arguably, numbers-wise, that would mean he's kind of the better commander, right? He has less soldiers die under his orders than Grant's soldiers, even if you accounted them equal, right? So Grant, even though he's strategically not as smart as Lee, he has numbers. It's a numbers game. He can sort of throw enough soldiers at them that they can win battles even when he's being outplayed, right? And that's how they start to turn the tide of this. They start to push towards Richmond, the Confederate capital, right? And at the same time, there was some worry that the South was waiting until the next presidential election to surrender. They were hoping that they could last long enough to potentially have a different president if they have to come back to the Union. Someone who might get rid of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Let them keep their slaves. So Grant puts a guy by the name of General Sherman in charge of a campaign in Georgia. And he tells Sherman to practice total war, to go in and destroy the countryside. Literally in this picture, they're tearing up train tracks, tear up the rails so they can't send supplies, burn down the fields, burn down these cities. And supposedly, if you were able to go back in time and look at an aerial view of Georgia, that you could actually see the path that Sherman took by the burned countryside. He literally carved his way through the state of Georgia in an attempt to break the morale of people living there, but also cut off some of these Confederate forces' supplies. And it's a really interesting thing because in some northern schools, General Sherman's seen of as a war hero, right? He helps to bring the war to a conclusion. He's following orders. In some southern schools, they're taught that Sherman is a criminal, that if he was not on the winning side, he would have been tried for war crimes after the war for the innocent people that he's responsible for, killed and destroyed their properties and all that stuff. in the North, you'll find there are some schools that are named after Sherman. You will not really find too many schools in the South named after the guy. That should give you an idea of how different parts of the United States view him. But this plays a role in putting that pressure on the South. Eventually, there's a 9-month-long siege at the town of Petersburg, where eventually Robert E. Lee and a small group flee Richmond. They are eventually caught, and they surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse. The famous, painting done of it, piece of art done of it. I love this one because it's very propagandy. If you were after having a 9-month siege, I really don't think that Robert E. Lee would be clean shaven, looking physically healthy. Everybody in this picture is like all nice and dressed nice and looks like they've all been well fed. After a 9-month siege, you're probably not looking too nice, right? But they do, surrender the Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War is over, but if you look at the cost of it, it's massive, right? You've got over 1 million U.S. soldiers dead. Almost every family in the entire United States, North and South, was affected directly in some way from the Civil War. Now, that's really vague, right? Because affected in some way could mean you had a family member who was enlisted in one of the armies. You had a family member who owned land that may or may not have been part of a conflict or an army went through, or your economy. You work for a business that's been affected by this war. So there's a lot of ways the war can affect you, right? Doesn't mean that every single person knew someone who fought in it, but a good chunk did. And the focus after this is, how do you rebuild a country that had just gone through something this devastating? And I'm not talking about just rebuilding, like as in, putting it back together, getting all the states back in. There's actual physical rebuilding, like repair damage done. But then there's also economic rebuilding, right? Because this is a huge thing. And on top of all that, you have to sort of reconcile, these people now have to be welcomed back in. And there are a lot of different ways that this could have been handled. This is known as Reconstruction, the putting back together of the United States. Obviously, if you know some basic history, we don't really get full Reconstruction the way it was intended, because Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated fairly quickly, right? But we'll talk in the next part about his plan specifically. But Lincoln kind of had his own plan for Reconstruction, and then you have a plan of his vice president, Andrew Johnson, and you also have a plan that Congress wants. So you have three sort of different perspectives as to how to go about reconciling the nation, bringing everyone back together. And it's hard. There's no perfect plan. I mean, Lincoln's plan that we know of wasn't perfect either. But what do you do with things like people who are in charge of the Confederate Army? Are they allowed to, or should they be punished for the war? People who are Confederate government members, should they be allowed to run now for U.S. government again? Like, if you were a member of the Confederate government, should you be allowed to become like a senator? These are questions people have to tackle. Where do you draw the line of forgiveness here? And there's no correct answer. And obviously, it's going to be a mess, just given the fact Lincoln's going to be assassinated. But you can make a very strong argument that Reconstruction did not succeed. That by the end of Reconstruction, that the United States was really no better off, that racism was still hugely a problem. You're going to have a civil rights movement in the 1950s, right? Almost 100 years after the Civil War. That should be a pretty good example that Reconstruction is not going to go very well, right? We'll get into that next time. Make sure that you get your chapter review done this week and submitted on Friday. Yeah. Take it easy.